On July 3rd, 1778, roughly 400 men marched out of a Pennsylvania fort to hunt a beaten enemy off their land. They believed they were chasing a retreat. 90 minutes later, almost every one of them was dead. Think about that number for a moment. Not a siege that ground on for months. Not a campaign measured in seasons and supply trains and the slow starvation of a city. 90 minutes. The fighting strength of an entire valley. Fathers, brothers, grandfathers, teenage boys who had eaten breakfast that morning in their own kitchens, beside their own families. Gone before the sun went down behind the mountains. When it was over, the commander of the attacking force sat down to write his report to the British post at Fort Niagara. He did not write of glory. He wrote, with the cold precision of a man accounting for inventory, that his allies had taken 227 scalps. He recorded 5 prisoners, and he noted, almost in passing, that he had stopped his warriors from killing more. His own side, by his own account, had lost just 3 men. Sit with that ratio, because every principle of warfare says it should be impossible. The men who died were nearly equal in number to the force that destroyed them. They were defending their own homes, the fiercest motivation a soldier can carry. They had walls 12 feet high they could have hidden behind. And they were erased anyway, not decimated, not defeated, but functionally deleted from existence, in less time than it takes to plow a single field. This was not a battle that was lost. It was an army that was switched off. And the most disturbing thing about it, the thing that should keep you watching, is that it did not happen because the defenders were cowards or fools or hopelessly outmatched. It happened because at the exact moment that courage mattered most, courage was the trap. Their bravery was the bait. Their pride was the trigger. And a patient man in the woods understood that better than they understood themselves. We like to believe that battles are decided by force, by numbers, by steel, by powder, by who is willing to stand and die when the other man runs. Wyoming was decided by something far smaller and far more frightening than any of that. It was decided by patience, by a single fire, set in exactly the right place at exactly the right hour, and in the end, by the difference between a man hearing the words "fall back" and a man hearing the word "run." We remember the massacres of history. We carve them into monuments and print them in school books. What we forget is that most of them were not chaos at all. Most of them were built deliberately, methodically, by someone who understood precisely how a frightened mind works, and who was willing to wait for terror to do what muskets could not. By the end of this video, you will understand how a defending militia, sitting safe behind an impregnable wall, was coaxed out into open ground and slaughtered in under an hour. You will understand why men with every conceivable advantage of home terrain marched willingly toward a swamp packed with hundreds of warriors they could not see, and why their own officers, who knew better, let them do it. You will see the single misheard command, 3 words, swallowed in gun smoke and screaming, that turned a disciplined battle line into a stampede of dying men. You will meet the famous war chief that American history blamed for this massacre for more than 100 years, a man who can be proven, beyond any argument, to have been hundreds of miles away when it happened. You will learn what occurred after dark on the surface of a flat gray boulder, and why the truth of that night is somehow both far less and far more terrible than the legend that grew over it. And you will understand the strangest twist of all. How a crushing American defeat, one of the worst military disasters of the entire Revolution, was rewritten almost overnight into a weapon. A weapon that would not merely rally a war-weary people, but would reach across an ocean to the floor of the British Parliament. and then turn back inland to erase a civilization that had stood for centuries before any European set foot on the continent. That is 5 open wounds in this story, and we are going to walk into every one of them. Because Wyoming was never really a battle. It was a trap, baited with fire, sprung with patience, and finished with grief. Everything that made it a catastrophe was decided before a single shot was fired by men who understood the oldest truth of war, that the surest way to destroy an army is to let it believe, for just a few fatal minutes, that it is winning. Before we walk down into that valley, take 1 second and hit the subscribe button. These frontier stories, the ones without the famous names, the ones that don't fit neatly into the legend, are the ones that get buried. Help us dig them back up. Now, let's step out through the gates of 40 Fort into the long, hot afternoon of July 3rd, 1778, to understand why one stretch of river bottom in northeastern Pennsylvania became, for 90 minutes, the most lethal ground in the entire American Revolution. You have to understand a hard truth. The killing did not begin with the British. The killing had been going on for 15 years before the British ever wanted anything to do with that valley. And the men who died in 1778 were, in a sense, paying a debt that had been accumulating their entire lives. Let us first set the larger stage. By the summer of 1778, the Revolutionary War had reached a turning point. The previous October, an entire British army under General John Burgoyne had surrendered at Saratoga. A catastrophe so complete that it pulled France into the war on the American side and shifted the whole shape of the conflict. The formal, European-style war, the kind fought with massed infantry and artillery and lines of men in bright coats, drifted southward toward the coast and the central seaboard. But out on the frontier, in the vast, trackless, heavily forested borderlands of northwestern New York and northern Pennsylvania, a very different war was boiling over. There were no front lines here, no formal battles, just raids, ambushes, burning cabins, and the slow, grinding war of attrition that has always defined the edge of empire. The British command up in Quebec had grown deeply anxious. With France now in the war, they feared the French might try to reclaim the Canadian territories they had lost a generation earlier. So Quebec adopted an aggressive defensive strategy, and it was a strategy built on a cold calculation. They would not waste their irreplaceable regular soldiers garrisoning the backcountry. Instead, they would arm 2 groups who already had every reason to want the frontier soaked in blood: displaced Loyalist refugees and the warriors of the Iroquois Confederacy. The intent behind this was deliberate and merciless, and it had 2 prongs. First, depopulate the agrarian frontier, burn the farms, scatter the families, and in doing so cut off the grain and cattle that fed George Washington's Continental Army. An army that cannot eat, cannot fight. Second, force the Continental Congress to peel regular troops away from the vital coastal theaters and send them inland to defend a wilderness that was almost impossible to defend. Bleed them in 2 directions at once. The Wyoming Valley sat squarely in the path of that plan, and it was a prize worth taking. It was rich, fertile bottomland strung along the north branch of the Susquehanna River, and that river was its curse as much as its blessing. In the 18th century, the Susquehanna was a logistical highway capable of floating grain and livestock and supplies all the way from New York down through Pennsylvania and into Maryland. The problem was that everyone believed the valley was theirs. And here we arrive at the original sin of the Wyoming story, the tangled root from which all the later horror grew. The English crown, in its careless and far-off way, had granted the same ground to 2 different colonies. In 1662, King Charles II had given Connecticut a royal charter whose western border ran in a straight line clear across the continent, sea to sea. And that line cut directly through the northern third of what would become Pennsylvania, slicing right through the Wyoming Valley. Then, in 1681, the very same crown handed William Penn a charter that overlapped the first one. 2 colonies, 1 valley, both holding genuine royal paper that said, in the king's own name, that the land belonged to them and to them alone. And beneath both of those paper claims stood the people who had actually lived on and bled for the ground. The Iroquois Confederacy, the Six Nations, the Haudenosaunee, claimed the valley by right of conquest. They had subdued other tribes across the region, and they used the rich Wyoming basin as a place to resettle their vassals, the Delaware, whom we also call the Lenape, along with the Nanticoke, the Munsee, and the Shawnee. To the Iroquois, this was not contested land at all. It was theirs absolutely. Then, in the mid-1750s, the balance shattered. The Iroquois sold the valley. They sold it out from under the very tribes they had settled there, handing it over to a Connecticut land speculation firm called the Susquehanna Company. Imagine it from the ground level. The Delaware families who farmed that soil were abruptly informed that distant chiefs had traded their homes for goods, and that they would have to leave. The resentment that planted would not stay buried. When the first Connecticut settlers, known up and down the frontier as the Yankees, began raising their cabins in the early 1760s, the displaced warriors answered them the only way they could. A raid in 1763 killed 20 settlers and forced the survivors to abandon the effort and flee for their lives. But the land was too rich to stay empty. Into the vacuum came settlers from Pennsylvania, the Pennamites. And what followed for the next decade was a sequence of events that would read like grim farce if you could ever forget that real men were dying inside it. In the spring of 1769, the Penn family moved to lock down their northern claim. They dispatched civil and military authority into the valley under a Captain Amos Ogden and the Northampton County Sheriff, John Jennings. These men built Fort Ogden at the mouth of Mill Creek, where it met the Susquehanna, and laid out a 20,000-acre manor. Pennsylvania had planted its flag. 3 weeks later, the Susquehanna Company answered. They sent a vanguard of 40 Connecticut Yankees, led by a Major John Durkee, down into the valley with orders to hold the land against the Pennsylvanians and the native tribes alike. And then began the cycle. Sheriff Jennings would arrest Major Durkee and his 40 men for trespassing and march them over the mountains to the jail at Easton. A merchant named Ledley would furnish their bail, and the 40 Yankees, freed, would simply turn around and trudge 240 miles back through the snow to reoccupy the very valley they'd just been dragged out of. Arrest, bail, march, reoccupy, a war of sheer mulish persistence. When the lawyers and sheriffs failed, the muskets came out. The conflict exploded into what history calls the Yankee-Pennamite Wars. For years, 2 groups of white settlers, men who in any honest accounting were neighbors, fellow colonists, soon to be fellow Americans, besieged each other's forts, burned each other's cabins, and contested the valley cabin by cabin and field by field. The Yankees, in time, won. They laid out 5 townships along the river, each one 5 miles square. And one of those townships they divided into 40 shares, one for each of the original 40 pioneers who had marched back through the snow. That township gave its name to the fort that sits at the dead center of everything that is about to happen. 40 Fort. Remember the number. 40 men, 40 shares, and a fort that should have saved them all. By 1774, the Yankees held the region firmly enough to formally annex it, incredibly, as a county of Connecticut, calling it Westmoreland County, though it sat deep inside Pennsylvania's borders. And then the Revolution arrived, and the local hatreds did something that should chill you. They did not fade. They did not dissolve in the face of a common British enemy. They simply changed their clothes. The Yankees, dominant and victorious, became patriots almost to a man. And the men they had beaten, the Pennamites, the New Yorkers, the families whose cabins had been burned and whose claims had been crushed, those men, overwhelmingly, became Loyalists. They were persecuted by their triumphant Patriot neighbors. They were jailed. Their property was confiscated. And many of them, dispossessed and furious, fled north to the British stronghold at Fort Niagara, carrying with them a very specific and very personal kind of hunger. So understand what is actually marching down the Susquehanna in the summer of 1778. It is not, in the deepest sense, a foreign army of invasion. It is, in large part, a homecoming of the dispossessed. It is displaced former neighbors riding beside displaced native warriors, both of them coming back down the river for land that had been taken from them, and for grudges that had never, not once, been allowed to cool. The valley had been stolen so many times over that no living man could honestly say who the rightful owner was. But every single person involved remembered with perfect clarity exactly who had wronged them. And in the summer of 1778, all of them were coming back at once to collect the debt. The warriors who would do the great bulk of the killing at Wyoming did not appear out of the dark. Like the demons the newspapers would later paint them, they came as a people in the middle of their own slow-motion apocalypse, fighting for survival in a war that was tearing their world apart from the inside. The American Revolution was an existential crisis for the Iroquois Confederacy, unlike anything in its long history. For generations, the Six Nations had endured by doing two things well: staying unified and playing the European powers against one another so that none could ever swallow them whole. The Revolution destroyed both strategies at once. It forced the member nations to take sides in a white man's war. And in doing so, it cracked the ancient Confederacy straight down the middle, setting nation against nation for the first time in living memory. The Seneca and the Cayuga came down hard on the side of the British, not out of love for a distant king, but out of a clear-eyed reading of their own survival. The Crown, for all its faults, was the only force on the continent that had ever shown the slightest interest in halting the endless westward flood of colonial settlers. The same flood that was, valley by valley, drowning their homeland. The British promised to hold that line. The Americans, by their every action, promised to erase it. That alliance had already been baptized in blood the year before, in 1777, at a brutal engagement called Oriskany. There, Seneca warriors had sprung an ambush on advancing American rebels and found themselves locked in a close-quarter slaughter so savage that it left deep scars on the men who lived through it. This was not the clean, ranged warfare of the open field. This was killing within arm's reach, for hours. One prominent Seneca leader, a man remembered as Governor Blacksnake, later spoke of the psychological weight of that day, of how the warriors had to make themselves numb simply to keep doing what the battle demanded, of a field carpeted with more dead than he had ever seen in his life. Historians who study this period have drawn a direct comparison between the inner state of those Iroquois warriors and that of hardened Continental Army veterans. Both were men grappling with the same unbearable moral weight of reciprocal violence, carrying the same invisible wounds home from the same war, on opposite sides of it. So the men coming to Wyoming were not strangers to horror. They had already been broken open by it once, and they had decided to keep fighting anyway. Because the alternative was the end of everything they were. And there was something else moving beneath the surface of their war-making, something far older than this revolution or any European war. A tradition the scholars call the Morning War. In many Iroquoian and Algonquian cultures, the death of a family member in combat created a wound in the fabric of the community that grief alone could not close. That wound demanded restitution, a spiritual rebalancing of the books. And there were two ways, and only two, to achieve it. The first was adoption. An enemy captive could be brought into the tribe, given the name and the place of the dead person, sat down at the empty seat by the fire, and thereby literally replace the one who was lost. The second was execution. A captive could be ritually put to death in a solemn and formal rite, so that one death answered another and the balance was restored. This was not bloodlust, in the way the colonial press would frame it. It was a sacred logic, a way of making sense of grief in a world drenched in death. But to a captured American militiaman, the distinction would have meant nothing at all. To him, it was simply the difference between living and dying, decided by a custom he did not understand. Hold this idea close, because before this story is finished, a grieving mother and a flat gray rock on the bank of the Susquehanna will give rise to the most infamous and most fiercely disputed legend in the whole bloody history of the Pennsylvania frontier. Standing precisely on the seam between the native and the colonial worlds, fluent in both, trusted by neither completely, and about to become legend, was a woman the settlers called Queen Esther. Her name was Esther Montour. And to understand her, you have to understand that the Montour name carried extraordinary weight across the entire northeastern frontier. The family were diplomats, cultural translators, power brokers who moved between worlds that could barely comprehend one another. Esther's grandmother, the celebrated Madame Montour, had been a prominent diplomat in her own right, a fixture of frontier negotiations. Her uncle, Andrew Montour, had held an actual commissioned captaincy under the British during the French and Indian War, and had led war parties during the great native uprising known as Pontiac's Rebellion. Even within her own lifetime, the family contained the whole war. Her cousin, John Montour, fought first for the British and then switched sides to support the rebel colonists. The Montour were not bystanders to the frontier conflict. They were woven into its every thread. Esther herself was a woman of mixed French and Iroquoian heritage, born around the year 1720. She married a Munsee Delaware chief named Egobund, and when Egobund died in 1772, something remarkable happened, something that tells you a great deal about the society she lived in. Esther did not simply become a widow and fade into the background. She inherited the sole leadership of the Munsee people, assumed her late husband's authority outright, and ruled in her own name. It was a striking testament to the genuine political equality that women held in her world, an equality that the European settlers around her, with their rigid hierarchies, could scarcely imagine. She was fully bilingual, speaking both Iroquoian and Algonquian dialects with ease, which made her an invaluable bridge. She presided over a village of roughly 70 houses, set at the strategic confluence where the Kemung River meets the Susquehanna. Those who met her described a large, heavily built woman who carried herself with a commanding, erect posture. Someone whose mere presence filled a room and ended arguments. And here is the part that the legend always omits, the part that makes her tragedy a tragedy rather than a horror story. For most of her life, by every available account, Queen Esther was kind. She treated white settlers with a uniform courtesy and even warmth. She was known for it. She was, for decades, exactly the sort of figure the frontier desperately needed. a person who could hold two peoples in her hands at once and keep them from each other's throats. But kindness has a breaking point, and Esther's was being approached steadily, year after year. The same relentless Connecticut land speculators who had taken the Wyoming Valley kept pushing north, swallowing more ground, and by 1776, they had forced her own Wyoming Delawares to abandon their lands and retreat north into Iroquois territory. The very engine of dispossession that had started the whole bloody cycle decades earlier was now grinding directly against her own people, her own family, her own authority. The woman famous for her courtesy was being transformed, not by some inborn savagery, but by accumulating loss, into a formidable adversary determined to reclaim her people's stolen sovereignty. She did not know it yet as the canoes gathered upriver, but she had one more loss still coming. The largest one, and it would arrive the very day before the battle. Now let us set the pieces on the board, fully and carefully, because the mismatch at Wyoming is not the one your instincts will expect. And understanding it is the difference between seeing a tragedy and seeing a magic trick. The force coming down the river was commanded by Major John Butler. He was a 50-year-old Loyalist, Connecticut-born, who had earned a hard reputation fighting for the British a generation earlier in the French and Indian War. Operating out of Fort Niagara, he had been tasked in late 1777 with raising a provincial corps, and the unit he built became known and feared up and down the frontier as Butler's Rangers. This was not a body of regular troops. It was a precision instrument, engineered for one purpose: irregular warfare in the deep woods. The Rangers were built to operate far behind enemy lines, to sever supply chains, and to spread terror through isolated settlements. They were recruited from experienced woodsmen, and several of their companies were explicitly required to speak the Iroquoian language and to understand native tactics from the inside. They were not soldiers who fought alongside native warriors as awkward allies. They were soldiers who fought, in many ways, as native warriors. Even their equipment told you what they were for. Where a British regular went to war in a bright red broadcloth coat that snagged on every branch and glowed like a target in green woods, the Rangers dressed to disappear. The record preserves two variations of their uniform, both prizing camouflage over parade ground vanity. Green woolen coats faced with white, or dark green faced and lined with scarlet. Buckskin Indian leggings or durable hemp trousers, round hats or black leather skull caps marked with a cockade, and brass plates stamped with the king's initials and the words Butler's Rangers. Every detail was chosen so a man could move silently through the dense Pennsylvania wilderness and kill in it, while a conventional British soldier would still be untangling his bright coat from the underbrush. Riding with the Rangers, and outnumbering them several times over, were the warriors, somewhere between 460 and 500 of them, drawn overwhelmingly from the Seneca and Cayuga nations, with contingents of Munsee, Delaware, and Shawnee. And they were led by one of the most formidable tactical minds on the entire North American continent, the Seneca war chief Sayenquiracta, a man the colonists rendered as Old Smoke, fighting alongside the rising young leader Cornplanter. Sayenquiracta was revered among his own people and respected by his enemies. A commander who understood the ground and the enemy's mind with an intuition that no amount of European drill could teach. And here we have to stop the narrative and deliberately, carefully kill a myth. Because it has survived for nearly 2.5 centuries, and it sits at the very heart of why this battle was so badly misremembered. For generations, American histories placed the famous Mohawk leader Joseph Brant, Thayendanegea, at the head of the Wyoming attack. It made for a satisfying story. Brant was charismatic, educated, an Anglican convert who had been to London, and he was genuinely, deeply feared by the Americans. He was the perfect villain for a frontier nightmare. There is just one fatal problem with the story. Joseph Brant was not at Wyoming. He was not anywhere near it. The primary documents and testimonials are clear, and they are not ambiguous. While Wyoming burned, Brant and his Mohawks were conducting their own separate operations far to the north, in New York. He had already raided the settlement of Cobleskill back in May. He could not have been in two places hundreds of miles apart. And yet the terror his name inspired was so total that traumatized survivors simply projected his presence onto the Wyoming assault. They reached for the most frightening name they knew and pinned it to their nightmare. And the early American historians, never letting accuracy spoil a good horror, wrote the fabrication down as established fact, where it calcified for over a century. Remember this: the single most famous fact about the Battle of Wyoming, who led it, is false. And it is false in a very particular direction, toward the most terrifying possible version of events. Keep that pattern in your mind, because by the end of this story, you will see that same machine running at full power. And you will understand that the lie about Brant was only a small piece of a much larger lie that changed the course of the war. So that is the attacking force. Roughly 600 men in all, a hybrid of rangers and warriors, experienced, mobile, woods-wise, and led by two commanders who understood irregular war down to their bones. Now, against them, the defenders. And here is where the cruelty of Wyoming reveals itself. The defense of the entire valley rested almost completely on the 24th Connecticut Militia Regiment. Local men, neighbors, and farmers, headquartered at 40 Fort under Colonel Nathan Dennison and Lieutenant Colonel George Dorrance. Back in 1775, the Continental Congress had authorized 2 independent continental companies to help defend the valley. But by 1778, these were badly depleted. One of them was actively led by a Captain Dethick Hewitt. Add it all together, and the Patriot force came to perhaps 360 to 400 men, militiamen, and a thin stiffening of regulars. These men possessed 2 enormous advantages, and it is vital to understand them because it makes what happened so much harder to bear. First, they were fighting for their own homes. Their wives and children were inside those fort walls. Their crops stood in the fields the enemy was burning. There is no fiercer motivation on the face of the earth, and these men had it in full. Second, they had walls, robust palisades, 12 feet high, behind which they could stand and wait for as long as patience required. But they carried 2 fatal weaknesses, and both of them were entirely human. The first was a lack of real tactical drill. They were brave and they were motivated, but they had almost never practiced the single hardest thing a soldier is ever asked to do: to maneuver under sustained, terrifying fire without coming apart. Courage is not the same as discipline, and on a battlefield the gap between the two is measured in lives. The second weakness was worse because it could not be solved by training. Their command structure was poisoned by politics. Overall command had fallen, almost by accident, to a Lieutenant Colonel Zebulon Butler. And yes, you heard that surname correctly. There were 2 Butlers about to fight this battle, one on each side, no relation to one another. And before the afternoon was out, they would be doing their level best to kill each other's men. Zebulon Butler was a genuine Continental Army officer who had come home to the valley on furlough in early June, only to find the entire region in a state of absolute alarm. Recognizing his real military experience, the local officers and Colonel Dennison formally begged him to take temporary supreme command of the valley's defenses. He agreed, but there was a louder, angrier voice in the council, and his name was Lazarus Stewart. Stewart was a militia captain and a firebrand. And here is the detail that should make you wince. He held his command at all only because his company had previously thrown out their own captain, ousted the man for the unforgivable sin of prudently advising defensive caution. These men had already fired one leader for being careful. They had selected, in his place, the man most opposed to caution in the entire valley. Stuart was driven by martial pride, by a deep and arrogant underestimation of native tactical discipline, and by a temperament that could not abide sitting still behind a wall while his world burned. He was exactly the wrong man to hold influence at exactly the wrong moment. So that is the true shape of the matchup at Wyoming. Not a tiny garrison overwhelmed by a horde. Two forces of nearly comparable size, but one of them mobile, experienced, woods-wise, and led with cold patience, and the other rooted, half-trained, fighting for everything it loved, and tearing itself apart from within over a single question: stay behind the walls or march out and fight. The walls would have held. We need to keep saying that, because it is the hinge of the whole tragedy. The walls would have held. It was the men who broke. Before the canoes touched the shore, it is worth pausing on the man who designed this, because what John Butler accomplished at Wyoming was not one with muskets. It was one inside the heads of his enemies, days before the first shot. There is a temptation to imagine the victor as a butcher, a man who simply had more warriors and let them loose. Butler was the opposite of that. Read his report, with its careful note that he had struggled to stop his allies from killing more prisoners, and you see a commander acutely aware of where the line of military utility sat, even amid a slaughter. His genius, and it was a genius, however dark, lay in understanding that an enemy behind a wall is nearly invincible, and an enemy out in the open is already half dead. The entire problem of Wyoming, from Butler's chair, was a single question. How do you move 400 armed and motivated men out from behind 12 feet of timber into a meadow of your choosing without firing a shot to do it? His answer was patience and theater. He did not threaten the fort into a panic that might have hardened it. He frightened the valley in small, visible increments, each one carefully calibrated to push the population toward the forts and the militia toward fury. He let the defenders' own internal divisions, the pride of men like Lazarus Stewart, the helpless rage of watching their farms burn, do the work that no assault could have done. He understood that a proud man, humiliated and afraid, will eventually do something reckless simply to feel like he is doing something at all. This is the quiet, recurring lesson of irregular warfare across every century. The side that controls where and when the fighting happens has already won most of the battle before it begins. Butler never let the Patriots choose the ground. He chose it for them, and then he made them want to march onto it. That is the work of a man who has studied the enemy's heart and found the exact place to press. Now the canoes are coming, and every move Butler makes from here is aimed at one outcome: getting the gate of 40 Fort to open from the inside. What Major John Butler executed over the final days of June was, in cold tactical terms, a masterpiece of asymmetrical warfare built on 3 pillars: stealth, psychological dislocation, and the oldest trick in the indigenous tactical playbook: drawing an entrenched enemy out of his fortifications and into an exposed killing ground. In early June 1778, the combined Loyalist and native force gathered at the native village of Tioga Point in New York, the staging ground for the descent into Pennsylvania. From there, they launched a swift riverine deployment, floating silently down the Susquehanna in an estimated 50 boats and canoes, a gliding, almost ghostly invasion that gave the valley little warning. By June 30th, they had reached the northern edge of the Wyoming Valley and made camp on high ground that gave Butler a sweeping, commanding view of the valley's entire defensive layout. He could see the forts. He could see the fields. He could, in effect, read the defender's hand before he played his own. Then the psychological campaign began, and its precision is genuinely chilling when you lay it out day by day. It started on June 12th, when a man named William Crooks was killed by native forces while scouting near Tunkhannock. A clear, bloody signal that the enemy was already operating freely just to the north of the valley. Then, on June 17th, a 5-man scouting party from one of the smaller forts was ambushed in its canoe. One man, Miner Robbins, was killed. Another, Joel Phelps, was wounded. The tactical effect of that single ambush was enormous and out of all proportion to its size. It suppressed Patriot reconnaissance almost entirely. The militia, suddenly afraid to send men out, pulled back inside their walls and went blind. They could no longer see what was coming. Then, on June 30th, the same day Butler's main force settled onto the high ground above the valley, came a localized attack on a tannery and a cornfield that left several dead and sent the survivors fleeing into the nearest fort. This was the psychological capstone. It triggered widespread civilian panic, driving hundreds of women and children to abandon their homesteads and crowd, terrified, into the fortifications. And a population paralyzed by fear is a population that pressures its soldiers to do something, anything, to make the terror stop. With the valley's nerve already fraying, Butler moved efficiently to dismantle the smaller northern outposts. By July 1st, his Loyalist spies had thoroughly mapped the Patriot's strength, and he sent his demands to the lesser forts. To their defenders, he offered a deal that sounded like mercy. Surrender peacefully, pledge strict neutrality, and you and your families will be protected from harm. Frightened and outmatched, those defenders surrendered readily. Butler's northern flank was now secure, and he had taken it without a fight. Then he turned to the prize. He dispatched messengers to 40 Fort, the Patriot headquarters, demanding its immediate surrender. Colonels Zebulon Butler and Nathan Dennison refused him flatly. But that brave, unified refusal was a mask. Behind the palisade, the Patriot command was tearing itself to pieces. A council of war was convened inside the fort, and it became a knife fight conducted in words. Zebulon Butler, Dennison, and Lieutenant Colonel Dorrance, the men who actually understood the nature of the enemy at their gates, argued, correctly and urgently, for a strictly defensive strategy. They were facing a faster, deadlier, more mobile force. Their advantage, their only real advantage, was the robust 12-foot palisade they stood behind. The answer was obvious to any trained soldier. Wait. Hold the walls. Reinforcements were said to be on the road. Continental companies under a Captain Spaulding and a Captain John Franklin were reportedly marching toward the valley. What the defenders could not know was that no real help was coming in time. Washington's main army was locked in the Monmouth campaign that very week, fighting its own desperate battle across New Jersey, and had no troops to spare for a frontier valley. Even so, every day of delay made the defenders stronger and the attackers, with their long supply lines and restless allies, weaker. Patience was not cowardice. Patience was the winning move. Lazarus Stewart called it cowardice anyway, fueled by martial pride, by a contempt for an enemy he refused to take seriously, and by a temperament that simply could not endure waiting. Stewart openly accused the senior officers of being afraid. The council deteriorated toward open mutiny. And while the officers argued, the rank-and-file militiamen were subjected to a form of torture that no commander could counter with logic. They could climb up onto the palisade and watch, in the middle distance, their own homes. The cabins they had built with their hands, the mills they depended on, the fields they had planted, being set ablaze by Loyalist scouts. Everything they had ever made was going up in smoke before their eyes, and they were being told to stand still and do nothing about it. By one bitterly critical account of that night, Stuart's aggressive faction worked their courage up by consuming 2 full barrels of whiskey, pouring fuel onto a fire of grief and rage and wounded pride. And so the 4 worst counselors a soldier can ever have, fury, sorrow, vanity, and drink, all gathered in one room and shouted down the only men giving sound advice. In the end, Zebulon Butler and Denison broke. And this is the part that must be understood clearly. They did not break because Stuart convinced them he was right. They broke because they could feel the militia about to fracture completely or desert outright if it was denied the chance to fight. To hold the army together for one more day, they agreed to throw it away. They consented to the desperate, doomed measure of marching out of 40 Fort to meet the enemy in open combat. It was the precise outcome John Butler had spent the better part of 2 weeks engineering. And he knew it was working because his spy network told him so the moment it happened. So he laid the final piece of the trap, and it was the most elegant piece of all. Observing the Patriots' chaotic preparations through his spies, Butler ordered his scouts to withdraw to one of the captured forts, and he directed that the recently seized Fort Jenkins be set ablaze. The rising column of black smoke over a burning fortification was not destruction for its own sake. It was a message, carefully written for an audience he understood completely. To a man already half convinced his enemy was retreating, the sight of the enemy burning his own fort read as one thing and one thing only: a rearguard putting the torch to its supplies to cover a hasty withdrawal up the river. They are running. They are burning what they cannot carry. Go now, go fast, before they escape and the chance is lost. The bait was lit. The fire that the defenders saw as their enemy in flight was, in truth, a hand reaching out of the smoke, beckoning them forward into the dark. The fort would have held. The men inside would not. At roughly 3 o'clock on the afternoon of July 3rd, 1778, somewhere near 400 men marched out through the gates of 40 Fort and turned to the northeast, advancing toward the Exeter Flats, toward the smoke, toward the burning fort, toward the enemy that they were sure was fleeing. It was hot. We actually have a reasonable sense of the weather because thoughtful men across the colonies were keeping meteorological records that summer. Even Thomas Jefferson was meticulously logging temperatures and barometric pressure during these very months. The mid-Atlantic July was typically hot and humid, heavy air that pressed down on a column of men already keyed up far past the point of clear thinking, men marching out on adrenaline and whiskey courage and the desperate need to do something at last. They moved in column up the river road, up what is today Wyoming Avenue, making brief tactical halts to read the ground ahead. And almost from the first halt, the warnings began. They were ignored, everyone. At a bridge crossing Abraham's Creek, a settler named Thomas Bennett looked hard at the terrain in front of them, at the convenient smoke and the conveniently retreating enemy. And he understood exactly what he was seeing. He said it to the officers plainly, without hedging, that they were marching straight into a snare and that they would be destroyed. His warning was waved off. So Bennett did the only thing a sane man could do. He turned around and walked back to the fort alone. He would live to see the next morning. Most of the men who ignored him would not. The column halted again on rising ground at a place called Sweatlands Hill. Here the scouts returned with the report Lazarus Stewart most wanted to hear. The forts to the north were burning, and the enemy appeared to be in full retreat. This was the moment, the last clean moment, for sober judgment to reassert itself. And the senior officers tried. Zebulon Butler, Dorrance, and Dennison made one final attempt to hold the line on that elevated, defensible position and simply wait for the reinforcements they knew were on the road. High ground, a chance to fight on their own terms, time on their side. It was, once again, the correct decision, and once again, Lazarus Stewart prevailed. The march continued. By 4 o'clock, the Patriots reached Abraham's Plains, a relatively open meadow threaded with stands of trees and patches of brush, about a mile out from the burning Fort Wintermoot. And here, Zebulon Butler did the single thing that converted a reckless idea into a death sentence. He deployed his men in the manner a European-trained officer had been taught to deploy them. He formed a traditional linear formation, a long, straight line, 2 ranks deep, stretching roughly 1,600 feet across the plain. Over 500 yards of men, shoulder to shoulder, in the open. He anchored his right wing on the steep banks that dropped down to the Susquehanna River, and held that wing himself. With Captain Hewitt's Continentals and the 1st Company providing the backbone. His left wing he placed under Colonel Dennison and Lieutenant Colonel Dorrance, and that wing stretched out toward a feature the European drill manuals had never prepared anyone for: a dense, brush-choked swamp. Take a moment to picture that formation, because its flaws are the whole battle. A rigid line, 2 men deep, standing in the open. One flank pinned against a riverbank, which at least could not be turned. The other flank stretching out toward a swamp that the militia could not see into and did not think to fear. It was a formation built for one kind of war, the formal, open-field European war of lines blasting away at one another across a meadow. And the enemy waiting for them had no intention whatsoever of fighting that kind of war, because the enemy was already there, already in position. Had been for some time. Major John Butler, in a calculated gesture, had stripped off his standard green ranger coat and removed the insignia of his rank, partly to stand as an equal among his native allies in a display of solidarity, and partly, shrewdly, to deny any American marksman a clear target in the form of the enemy commander. He tied a black handkerchief around his head so that his own men could identify him in the chaos to come, and he took his place. He deployed his Rangers in the center of the line, directly opposing the Patriot right. And he gave them a single iron order: lie flat in the tall grass and do not fire, not one shot, until the enemy has closed to point-blank range, until you cannot possibly miss. But the true killing stroke, the masterwork of the day, belonged to Sayanquiragta. The old Seneca chief took his enormous force of warriors, 400, perhaps 500 men, and concealed them entirely, out of all sight, within the thick vegetation of the swamp that bordered the Patriot left flank. Hundreds of warriors, breathing slow and silent in the brush, waiting, while 400 Americans formed a tidy line in the open meadow and quietly congratulated themselves on running down a beaten foe, believing they held the initiative, believing they were the hunters closing on fleeing prey. The Patriots advanced aggressively. At a distance of roughly 200 yards, Zebulon Butler gave the order to open fire, and his men did it beautifully. 3 successive rolling volleys delivered at 30-yard intervals as they marched steadily forward. It was a textbook advance, and the Loyalist skirmishers facing them did the most dangerous and disciplined thing an enemy can do under fire. They returned fire selectively, weakly, and they fell back, and fell back, and fell back again, drawing the rigid Patriot line forward, deeper, tighter, ever further into the ground that had been chosen for their destruction. The swamp had not been empty. It had only ever been patient. Pause the advance for a moment. with the Patriots strung across the meadow and the swamp full of silent men. And let us name precisely what is about to happen. Because the tactic that destroyed the Wyoming militia is one of the oldest and most lethal in all of warfare. And understanding it is the difference between watching a slaughter and understanding one. What Sayenqueragta has set is an envelopment of the flank. A battle line is strongest when it faces forward, every musket pointed the same way, every man protected by the men beside him. But a line has ends, and the end of a line is its great vulnerability, because the men at the end can be attacked from the side and the rear, where their formation gives them no protection and their fire cannot easily be brought to bear. Wrap around the end of an enemy line, and you do not merely add pressure. You unmake the very thing that makes a line work. You turn an organized body of soldiers into a confused crowd of frightened individuals, each one suddenly aware that death is coming from a direction he cannot face. The correct answer to a threatened flank has been known to soldiers for thousands of years, and Colonel Dennison, to his credit, knew it. It is called refusing the flank. When you see the enemy moving to wrap your end, you wheel that end company backward, pivoting it like a swinging gate until it forms a right angle with the main line. Now the men at the end are facing the new threat squarely, their formation reconstituted, their fire pointed where the danger actually is. Done cleanly by drilled and steady troops, it can blunt an envelopment entirely. But there is the rub, and it is the whole tragedy of Wyoming compressed into a single tactical fact. Refusing the flank is one of the most demanding maneuvers in 18th century warfare. It requires men to move backward and sideways, deliberately and in formation, while under fire and while terrified, to perform a complex, counterintuitive evolution. At the exact moment, every instinct in their bodies is screaming at them to run. It requires drill so deep that it has become reflex, the kind of drill that only comes from endless dull hours on a parade ground that these farmer militiamen had never spent. So here is the trap in its full form. Butler's Rangers in the center, invisible in the grass, holding their fire to deliver one shattering blow at point-blank range. Sayenqueragta's warriors in the swamp, poised to roll up the undrilled left flank, and a Patriot line being drawn forward by a fake retreat, stretched and committed and certain it is winning. Every element interlocks. The fake retreat baits the advance overextends the line. The overextension exposes the flank. The exposed flank meets a maneuver the militia cannot perform, and the failure of that one maneuver detonates everything. It was not luck. It was not numbers. It was a machine assembled out of human psychology and terrain and patience, and it was about to be switched on. At 100 yards, the world came apart. A war cry rose out of the swamp on the Patriot left, sudden, immense, the voices of hundreds of warriors loosed at once. And it did to the militia's nerve precisely what it had been intended to do across centuries of such cries. It struck them like a physical blow, instantly shattering their composure. And in the very same instant, all along the center of the field, Butler's Rangers came up off the ground out of the tall grass where they had been lying invisible, and they delivered one massive, coordinated, point-blank volley straight into the Patriot right. For the first few minutes, against all the odds and all the planning, it was a real and savage fight. The Americans, brave to the last and fighting for everything they loved, returned fire so fiercely that the Loyalist line actually buckled. Historians note that the Rangers gave way before the galling fire of the Americans, falling back in spite of their officers' efforts to hold them. And here, Zebulon Butler made his fatal misreading. The kind of mistake any commander can make when the battlefield has vanished into a fog of black powder smoke and noise. He saw the Loyalist line buckle and fall back, and he read it as a rout. He believed, for one fatal moment, that he was breaking them. He ordered his right wing to press forward and finish the job. It was not a rout, it was a reload. The Rangers were professionals, and a brief fallback to reload and reform was simply part of their craft. They reformed their lines in seconds and resumed a punishing, disciplined rate of fire that arrested the American advance dead in its tracks and began dropping the militiamen where they stood. The momentum the Patriots thought they had seized turned to ash in their hands. But the battle was not going to be decided on the right. Where men were trading volleys, it was going to be decided on the left. In the swamp, Sayenquiragta poured his Seneca and Cayuga warriors out of the brush in a flawless flanking maneuver. Not merely striking Denison's flank, but flooding entirely around and behind the rear of his wing, exactly as the old chief had planned. And Denison, seeing his left being enveloped, reacted correctly by the book. He ordered the company on his threatened flank to fall back and wheel to the left, to swing that end point backward into a right angle with the main line, to refuse the flank and face the swamp head-on. And here it is. The hinge of the entire battle, the hinge of the entire valley's fate. 3 words, spoken into a roaring hell of musket fire, screaming war cries and choking smoke so thick that men could barely see the comrades beside them. Fall back. It is a precise tactical command. Spoken on a parade ground, every drilled soldier understands it instantly. Pivot, reposition, hold the new line. But these were not drilled soldiers. They were farmers and millers and boys, half deafened by the roar of their own muskets, blind in the smoke, with hundreds of warriors howling out of a swamp into their rear. They did not hear a tactical command. In that din, in that terror, they heard the one thing their fear had already prepared them to hear. They heard the only word that mattered. They heard, "Run." The disciplined wheel collapsed into headlong flight before it could ever take shape. The order to reposition was understood as the order to flee, and the warriors, who had been waiting for this single moment through their entire silent approach, saw the American left falter, break formation, and dissolve. And they surged out of the swamp, into the gap with tomahawks and war clubs, into a line that was a line no longer. The panic spread down the formation the way a crack races across a frozen lake. Once the left went, the men beside it saw it go, and their own nerve went with it. Officers threw themselves against the tide and could not stop it. Lieutenant Colonel Dorrance fought to hold his men. Captain Hewitt flatly refused to retreat and was cut down standing at his post, killed where he had planted himself. It changed nothing. The entire American line, 500 yards of men, shattered into fragments. The actual firefight, from the first volley to the final collapse, had lasted somewhere around 30 to 45 minutes. That was the battle. Everything that followed was not a battle at all. It was the dying, and it would stretch out across the rest of that 90-minute window and into the night. Denison had given the order to fall back. The valley had heard the order to run, and in that one mistranslation, 400 men stopped being an army and became prey. What came after the line broke was not combat. It was a hunt, and it was conducted with the cold efficiency of men who do this work for a living. The militiamen, in their blind panic, threw away their heavy muskets to run faster, which meant only that they now died unarmed, with nothing in their hands to slow a pursuer. They fled back toward the perceived safety of 40 Fort, or toward the river, or simply toward anywhere that was not here. And the Seneca, the Cayuga, and the Rangers ran them down. Through the open fields, through the agricultural land, through the trees, the pursuers chased the exhausted, terrified, weaponless soldiers and killed them as they caught them. The men who reached the Susquehanna and threw themselves into the water, trying to swim for the eastern bank and survival, were frequently shot in the river or struck down with tomahawks the instant they crawled, gasping, onto the far shore. Of the roughly 400 men who had marched so confidently out of the gates at 3 o'clock, something like 60 made it back inside the walls alive. Zebulon Butler was one of them. Nathan Dennison was one of them. The fighting strength of the entire valley, very nearly every able-bodied man in the whole region, had been functionally annihilated between 4 o'clock and nightfall. When Major John Butler tallied the day for his superiors at Fort Niagara, the numbers were these. His allies had taken 227 scalps, and they held 5 prisoners. And he added a line that tells you how thin the leash had been all along. That it was only with the greatest difficulty that he had prevented his warriors from killing even more of the prisoners, so total was their rage. That difficulty has a name in legend, and a far murkier reality behind it. It carries us to Queen Esther, and to the most controversial passage in this entire story, the one that demands the most care, because here, more than anywhere else, the history and the myth have grown into each other until they are hard to pull apart. Start with what is solid, because some of this is not in dispute. Prisoners were killed after the battle, and that much comes from the enemy's own side. John Butler himself wrote that it was only with the greatest difficulty that he stopped his warriors from killing more of the captives, which tells you plainly that captives were being killed. Survivor accounts describe somewhere between 30 and 40 men, surrendered or run down, tortured and put to death in the hours after the rout. One captured officer, by several accounts, was bound to a tree and burned. The killing of prisoners at Wyoming is real history, and it is grim enough on its own. The cultural logic behind such killings was also real and worth understanding. In many Iroquoian and Algonquian traditions, a death in battle demanded restitution through what scholars call the mourning war. A grieving family could either adopt a captive to take the dead one's place or ritually execute one to balance the loss. It was not random bloodlust. It was a solemn accounting of grief. And the traditional accounts supply a motive that fits that logic exactly. That shortly before the battle, Queen Esther's son had been killed, and that she came to the field consumed by sorrow and rage. From there, the legend takes over, and it matters to be honest about where the history ends and the legend begins. The story, as it hardened over the following century, is vivid and terrible. Captured soldiers, the tradition says, somewhere between 14 and a few dozen, were bound and arranged in a circle around a large flat boulder, each man held by 2 warriors, while Queen Esther moved among them, chanting, and killed them one by one with a stone maul. The boulder still sits on the bank of the Susquehanna. For generations it has been called Bloody Rock or Queen Esther's Rock. But here honesty has to slow the story down, because modern historians treat this particular scene with real skepticism, and they have good reasons. The detailed, theatrical version of Queen Esther at the Rock did not appear in full until the middle of the 19th century, decades after the battle, in an era when American writers and local commemorators were busily romanticizing and sometimes outright inventing dramatic frontier tales. The roadside marker at the Rock dates only to 1897, the monument to 1962. Even the woman's identity is tangled, with Queen Esther Montour frequently confused in the records with her relative Catherine Montour. And the image fit a little too perfectly into the propaganda machine that was already turning a military defeat into a story of pure savagery. Historians who have studied how this battle was remembered conclude that the Bloody Rock episode is, at the very least, heavily embellished, and quite possibly a legend grafted onto the real, grimmer, less cinematic fact that prisoners were killed that night. The survivor tradition even names two men who supposedly broke from the circle and lived: Lebbeus Hammond and Joseph Elliot. In the telling, Elliot sprinted for the river, took a musket ball in the shoulder, and swam to the far bank, staggering into a fort that evening wearing nothing but his trousers and soaked in blood. Hammond ran for the woods, hid behind a tree in the dark while his pursuers lost his trail, and reached 40 Fort by morning. Their escape is a fixture of the local accounts. Whether it happened exactly as told or grew in the retelling like so much else about that night, we can no longer say with confidence. So here is the honest bottom line, and it matters for everything that follows. Prisoners were killed at Wyoming. That part is real, and it is terrible. The cinematic spectacle of Queen Esther and the Mall is something else. A legend that calcified into fact over the following century. And it should be told as legend, not as documented history. And even the worst of what truly happened fell on combatants and captured soldiers, the men who had marched out that afternoon to fight. It was not, as the printing presses of the eastern cities were about to scream to the world, the cold-blooded mass murder of women and children locked in their homes. Hold that distinction with both hands, because everything that follows, the propaganda, the parliamentary debate, the destruction of an entire nation, turns on the gap between what actually happened at Wyoming and what people were told had happened. On July 4th, 1778, Independence Day itself, 2 years almost to the week after the Declaration was signed, Major John Butler walked up to the gates of 40 Fort and demanded its formal surrender. Zebulon Butler was no longer there to refuse him. As a Continental officer, his life would not be safe in any surrender. And the night before, he had slipped down the river with his family and the few regulars he could gather, withdrawing from the valley entirely. That left Colonel Nathan Dennison with a fort full of widows, orphans, and the very old, to do the surrendering. Recognizing the absolute futility of further resistance, Dennison agreed to the terms, and the Americans were paroled on the promise that they would not take up arms again. A promise some of them, Dennison included, would break within months. And here the historical truth diverges hard and sharply from the legend in a way that matters enormously. The British and Loyalist objective was never the slaughter of the population. It was something colder and, in its own way, more total. Butler's strategic aim was to permanently destroy the valley's capacity to feed and supply the Continental Army, to erase it as a resource, not to erase it as a people. So his men set about that work methodically. They destroyed 8 palisaded forts. They burned every mill in the region. And on the frontier, a mill was not a convenience. It was the difference between grain and starvation. They burned approximately 1,000 homes and barns. They slaughtered or drove off roughly 1,000 head of cattle, along with vast numbers of sheep and swine. The devastation was as close to total as fire and effort could make it. When desperate women begged the Rangers to leave them even a few cows so their children might survive the coming winter, they were told flatly that it was against Colonel Butler's explicit orders to leave any resource intact. The valley was to be rendered useless, down to the last animal. And yet, crucially, the formal terms of surrender regarding the non-combatants were, by and large, honored by the British command. The women and children were not systematically murdered within the forts. That, again, is the truth the legend would bury. Major Butler's goal was depopulation, not extermination. The civilians were simply ordered to abandon the valley entirely and never return. Gather what little you can carry and leave. That order set in motion one of the great forgotten tragedies of the entire revolution: the desperate exodus that came to be called the Great Runaway, or the Great Flight. By the 1st of August, a colonel reporting to the colony's governing council recorded that 4/5 of the inhabitants had fled, struck by what he called a most extraordinary panic, leaving the Wyoming settlement almost totally destroyed. Thousands of terrified settlers, many of them stripped of adequate clothing, with little food and less shelter, fled the burning valley eastward, aiming for the safety of established towns like Stroudsburg and Easton, far across the mountains near the Delaware River. But the road to safety did not run through gentle country. It forced them straight through the treacherous, unforgiving terrain of the Pocono Mountains, through a vast, dense, swampy, mountainous wilderness with no provisions and no mercy. They died on that trek. They died of exhaustion and exposure and starvation, mothers and children and the old, scattered through the deep woods, falling behind, lying down, never getting up. So many perished crossing that dismal swamp that the survivors gave it a name the locals never let go of. They called it the Shades of Death. And every refugee who staggered out the eastern side of that wilderness carried two things into the cities of the coast. They carried a story of slaughter, half glimpsed, half imagined, magnified by terror at every campfire along the way. And they carried a bottomless willingness to believe absolutely anything, no matter how monstrous, about the people who had done this to them. The frontier remembers its generals and immortalizes its battles. It forgets the woman who lay down in the shades of death with a child on her back and no name in any record that survives. That is what war does. It celebrates the men who drew the strategy, and it buries the ones who paid for it. It is worth stopping the machinery of strategy for a moment, here in the smoke and the burning fields, to remember what these numbers actually were. When we say 400 men, we are saying something the mind resists feeling. We are saying that in a single valley, in a single afternoon, nearly every husband, nearly every father, nearly every grown son was killed. Picture the morning after. Picture 44th the next day. Full of women who already knew, because only 60 men came back, and they could count, that most of them were now widows, and that most of their children were now fatherless, and that this had all happened in the span of a single hot afternoon, while they waited behind the walls and listened to the firing in the distance. There is a man in the survivor testimony, struck down while carrying his belongings to safety. There is another, killed with his child against his chest, the child handed back to its mother. There are the men run down within sight of the fort, killed reaching for a safety that was never going to come. These are not statistics. Each one was the entire world to someone. And there is a hard symmetry here that the propaganda would work very hard to erase. The warriors who did this killing were, many of them, men who had buried their own sons and brothers in this same war. Men acting out a grief that was every bit as real as the grief now filling 40 Fort. Queen Esther herself, if the legend holds any truth at all, came to that field because her own child lay dead. None of this excuses the horror, but it explains it, and explanation is the thing that propaganda cannot allow, because an enemy you understand is harder to hate, and an enemy you cannot hate is harder to destroy. That is the quiet truth underneath every massacre on every frontier in every century. The men on both sides are usually grieving the same kind of loss in the same war, and the machine of vengeance feeds on both their sorrows equally. Wyoming was a slaughter. It was also two peoples, locked together, drowning in the same blood. Now hold that human truth in your mind, and watch how completely, how deliberately, it is about to be thrown away. Here is the turn that elevates Wyoming from a frontier tragedy into one of the most consequential events of the entire war. Because what the Patriots could not achieve on the battlefield, anything resembling victory, they achieved, brilliantly and ruthlessly, In print. The transformation of the Battle of Wyoming into the Wyoming Massacre stands as a genuine masterclass in the weaponization of information, executed at a moment in history when most armies had not yet grasped that information could be a weapon at all. The raw facts were these. A Patriot army had been lured out of its defenses and destroyed. Captured soldiers had been killed, and some tortured in the hours after the rout. That much is real. The mass murder of women and children was not. That was the truth, and the truth was already terrible enough to make a nation weep. But the truth was not what got printed. As the refugees poured into the eastern cities, carrying their terror up out of the shades of death, the newspaper publishers seized on their accounts and inflated them past all recognition. Within weeks, papers were printing sensationalized stories, sourced to distressed refugees, claiming that the valley's population of some 5,000 had been all but exterminated, that hundreds of women and children had been massacred in cold blood, or locked inside their own homes and burned alive by what one account called raving bands of Indians and Tories. It was categorically false. The battlefield dead were almost exclusively combatants. There had been no mass burning of families locked in their houses. The numbers were wild invention, but the lie was vivid and the lie was useful. And a vivid, useful lie travels in a way that a complicated truth never can. The fabricated version was distributed everywhere, accepted as proven historical fact, and repeated by prominent and respectable writers for decades afterward. And notice, this is the very same machine we watched earlier, the one that put Joseph Brant at the head of an attack he was hundreds of miles away from. Reach for the most terrifying name, the most monstrous image, and write it down as fact, because fear persuades where accuracy cannot. And it worked. The lie accomplished two enormous strategic objectives, either one of which would have justified the effort. First, it completely re-galvanized a war-weary American populace. By the summer of 1778, the revolution had dragged on for years. The initial fervor had cooled, and the danger for the Patriot cause was a slow drift toward exhaustion and indifference. The Wyoming Massacre cured that drift overnight. It handed every wavering colonist a fresh, burning, intimate reason to hate the enemy and to keep fighting. It demonized the Loyalists and their native allies so thoroughly that reconciliation became unthinkable, and it generated a fervent, widespread hunger for revenge. A defeat had been transmuted into a recruiting poster. Second, and this is the part that almost no one anticipated, the lie did not stop at the colony's edge. The Crown's use of native warriors on the frontier was already a bitter controversy inside Britain itself. The practice had been denounced on the floor of Parliament before Wyoming was ever fought, most famously by the Earl of Chatham and by Edmund Burke, who mocked and condemned the employment of indigenous allies as a stain on British honor. Fresh accounts of frontier atrocity, however exaggerated, handed that opposition new ammunition and deepened the embarrassment of a government already accused of waging a savage and unwinnable war. A massacre that had not happened the way the papers described it was, even so, doing real damage to Britain's standing in the eyes of the world. So consider the full, strange arc of it. The men of the Wyoming Valley lost their battle in 90 minutes. They marched out to defend their homes, and they failed utterly, and most of them died for nothing they could see. But the story of their deaths, the false, inflated, weaponized story, went on to do more damage to the British cause than any victory those men could possibly have won on Abraham's Plains. They could not have known it as they died in the meadow and the river. Their slaughter, magnified into a lie and aimed like a cannon, became one of the single most effective pieces of propaganda of the American Revolution. The truth had been buried in a swamp called the Shades of Death. The lie marched all the way to London, and it won. The story of Wyoming should end with the burned valley and the lie that outgrew it. It does not. Because the deepest consequence of those 90 minutes was not the tragedy of the valley itself. It was the far larger catastrophe that the valley set in motion. A catastrophe that fell, in the end, not on the British, but on the Iroquois. The immediate American response was local, and it was furious. In late September of 1778, a Colonel Thomas Hartley led a punitive expedition into the backcountry of Pennsylvania and New York, seeking to avenge the dead of Wyoming. His forces burned native towns up the Susquehanna as far as Tioga, and with deliberate, pointed symbolism, they destroyed the Munsee village associated with the Montour family, the place the records call Queen Esther's Town, near the confluence of the Kemung and the Susquehanna. The home of the woman the legend had already cast as the villain of Wyoming was put to the torch in turn. Grief answering grief, fire answering fire, exactly as the morning war tradition had always promised it would. But these local raids were judged by the American High Command to be wholly insufficient to the scale of the threat. The catastrophic loss of the Wyoming Valley's agricultural output, combined with another devastating joint Loyalist Iroquois raid that fell on Cherry Valley, New York, that November, forced General George Washington to fundamentally rethink his strategic priorities. 2 breadbasket valleys gutted in a single season. An army that needed to eat. A frontier coming apart at every seam. Washington's own views on native peoples were not simple, and the record makes the irony of what he ordered all the sharper. A decade before the war, in a 1769 letter to John Armstrong, Washington had vehemently condemned the unprovoked killing of native people by white settlers, calling it plainly villainy and murder, demanding that justice be done and recognizing the strategic dangers such unprovoked violence invited. He had understood, once, the moral weight of it, but by 1779, the calculus had changed beyond recognition. The governor of New York warned that the entire frontier of the state might be driven all the way back to the Hudson River if the Iroquois raids were allowed to continue. Faced with the starvation of his army and the collapse of his frontier, Washington concluded that relying on scattered state militias against the highly mobile Ranger and Iroquois forces was simply impossible. He had watched at Wyoming exactly what happened when local militia tried to meet that enemy in the field. So in 1779, the man who had once called the killing of native people villainy commissioned a massive, coordinated offensive designed to eliminate the Iroquois threat permanently. In his orders to Major General John Sullivan and General James Clinton, Washington did not call for a conventional victory or the defeat of an enemy army. He called for the total, systematic destruction of the homeland of the Six Nations. The strategic objective, in his own framing, was to push the frontier back, to ruin the Iroquois capacity to wage war by destroying their food supply at its source, and to take hostages to compel future compliance. The resulting Sullivan expedition, the Sullivan-Clinton campaign, was an enormous undertaking for that war. It marshaled 4 full brigades of Continental regulars, roughly 4,000 men, drawn from several states, and marched them, in Washington's own blunt phrase, toward the total destruction and devastation of the Iroquois settlements, deep into the Finger Lakes region, the agricultural heart of Iroquois country. That such a vast body of regular troops could be pulled from the main war against the British and pointed at the frontier is itself a measure of how existential those raids had come to seem. And Sullivan's army did exactly what it was sent to do. It executed a methodical scorched earth campaign across the homeland of the Six Nations. It destroyed 40 Iroquois villages. It burned an enormous quantity of stored corn, vegetables, and orchards. not just the harvest of one season, but the accumulated agricultural infrastructure of generations. The fruit trees that took decades to grow and could not simply be replanted. It broke the agricultural and logistical backbone of the entire Confederacy in a matter of weeks. The human result was a slow catastrophe. Forced to flee for shelter to British-held Fort Niagara, the displaced Seneca and Cayuga found inadequate provision and impossible numbers. Thousands died of starvation and exposure during the brutal winter of 1779 and 1780. The very fate, the destruction of a people through the destruction of their food, that they themselves had been sent to inflict on the Wyoming Valley. While Iroquois warriors continued to launch sporadic, desperate raids until the war's end, their capacity to act as a unified strategic threat was permanently shattered. Sullivan's campaign marked, in effect, the end of Iroquois sovereignty across the upper Susquehanna and western New York. The close of a power that had dominated the Northeast since long before any European arrived. That is the true and terrible weight of those 90 minutes on Abraham's Plains. A militia was lured into a swamp and slaughtered. The lie told about their slaughter enraged a nation and shamed an empire. And the rage, harnessed by a desperate commander who had once condemned exactly this kind of violence, ended a civilization that had stood for centuries. The trap at Wyoming caught 400 men. The consequences of Wyoming caught a whole people. Before we close, the people deserve their endings. Because in a story this large, it is easy to let them dissolve back into the statistics. And they earned better than that. Major John Butler, the architect of the whole design, the man in the black handkerchief who had spent 2 weeks reaching into his enemy's mind, survived the war. He lived out his years in Canada, and the corps he raised, Butler's Rangers, was remembered as one of the most effective irregular units of the entire conflict. A verdict written in the ruin of the Wyoming Valley. Zebulon Butler, the other Butler, the Continental officer who had argued for caution and been overruled by louder and angrier men, escaped the slaughter and survived the war. He carried with him for the rest of his life the knowledge that he had been right, that the walls would have held, that the reinforcements were coming, that the only thing required was patience, and that being right had cost him nearly every man he led. Lazarus Stewart, the firebrand who called his commanders cowards, who consumed his courage by the barrel, who drove the army out from behind the walls and onto Abraham's Plains in search of a glory he was certain awaited him, did not survive the consequences of his own argument. He was killed in the very fight he had demanded, swallowed by the disaster he had insisted upon. The man who would not wait did not live out the afternoon. Sayenqueragta, the old Seneca war chief whose patience in the swamp had won the day so completely, was one of the finest tacticians the continent produced. And his reward for that brilliance was to watch Sullivan's army burn his homeland to ash. His victory at Wyoming was, in the long arithmetic of the war, the thing that called down the fire upon his own people. There is no crueler lesson in the whole story than that. Queen Esther Montour vanishes back into the broken history of her people. Her village burned in revenge by Hartley's men, her name bound forever, fairly or not, to a single gray stone on the riverbank. She had been, for most of her life, a woman known for kindness. History remembers her almost entirely for the Mall and the Circle, and for the night her grief became legend. A legend we can no longer fully separate from the truth. Joseph Brant, and let it be said one final time, clearly, was never at Wyoming at all. He was hundreds of miles to the north, fighting his own war, and he spent the following 2 centuries being blamed for a massacre he had no part in, his name pinned to the nightmare by terrified men who reached for the most frightening figure they knew. If you remember one correction from this entire account, let it be that one, because it is the small thread that unravels the whole comfortable legend. And Lebbeus Hammond and Joseph Elliot, the two men the survivor tradition remembers throwing off their captors and running into the dark, live on as the human faces of that night, their escape retold for 2 centuries. Whether it happened precisely as the legend tells it, no one can now say for certain. But what they came to stand for is true enough: that prisoners were killed after the battle, and that this grim, specific reality was a world away from the newspaper fantasy of families burned alive in their homes. The gap between those 2 stories is, in the end, the gap between what happened at Wyoming and what America chose to remember. Here is the pattern, if you stand back far enough to see it. History remembers the famous chief who was absent and forgets the war chief who actually won. It remembers and exaggerates the massacre that was invented and softens around the executions that were real. It celebrates the army that was erased and names a swamp after the families who died fleeing it. The men who drew the strategy are studied in books. The men and women who paid for it are statistics, or legends, or nothing at all. Perhaps that is simply what frontier war does in the end. It keeps the legend and loses the people. We began with a single number: 90 minutes. An entire American army erased in less time than it takes to plow a field. But the longer you look at Wyoming, the clearer it becomes that the number was never really the point. The men of the valley did not die because they were outnumbered. They very nearly matched the force that destroyed them. They did not die because they were weak or because their walls were thin. Their walls were 12 feet of solid timber and would have held for as long as the defenders needed them to hold. They did not even die, in the end, for any lack of courage. They had courage to spare. That was precisely the problem. They died because a patient enemy understood something about fear that they did not understand about themselves. He understood that a frightened man will march willingly toward a burning fort because he wants, desperately, against all evidence, to believe his enemy is running. He understood that a proud man, watching his home burn, will call caution cowardice until the very cowardice he fears becomes the panic that kills him. And he understood that an exhausted, half-deafened farmer, choking on black powder smoke with the screams of the swamp in his ears, will hear the words, "Fall back," and his whole body will scream a single word in answer: run. Wyoming was not lost on Abraham's plains. It was lost in the council of war the night before, in the whiskey and the wounded pride and the firebrand who could not bear to wait. It was lost in the smoke, where 3 precise words became one fatal one. The trap was sprung before the first shot was ever fired, by a man who knew that the surest way to destroy an army is to convince it, for just a few minutes, that it is winning. The valley grew back. The mills were rebuilt, the farms replanted, the forts left to rot into the ground and be forgotten. Grass grew over Abraham's plains. But the lie told about those 90 minutes outlived every single man who fought there. It lit a fury that crossed an ocean to the floor of Parliament. And then it turned back inland and sent 4,500 soldiers to burn a homeland that had stood for 1,000 years. The men of 40 Fort died for nothing they could see. And then their deaths, multiplied by terror and rewritten by their own countrymen, went on to shape this war more profoundly than any victory they could have won. There is a final, bitter symmetry in it. The Iroquois came to Wyoming, in part, to answer their own grief and to reclaim their own stolen land. They won the most complete tactical victory of the frontier war. And that victory was the precise thing that brought Sullivan's torches into their valleys the following year and broke them forever. They destroyed the Wyoming Valley to feed an army and to balance a grief And in doing so, they fed the legend that destroyed them. The men of 40 Fort thought they were marching out to save their homes. They could not have known that the fire they mistook for an enemy in retreat was only ever a hand, reaching out of the smoke, beckoning them forward into the dark. They marched out to chase a ghost. The ghost was waiting for them. The battle lasted half an hour. The lie lasted 200 years. And by sundown, on the 3rd of July, in a valley whose name most people today could not find on a map, an entire American army had simply ceased to exist. Proof, written in blood and smoke and a single misheard word, that sometimes a battle is not decided by who is stronger or who is braver or who has more men. Sometimes it is decided by who is patient enough to wait in the swamp.